Now for today's program. Ting Ting Cheng is a civil rights attorney and activist and director of the Equal Rights Amendment Project at Columbia Law School. Prior to joining the ERA project, she litigated gender discrimination cases at Legal Momentum, the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund. She was also an attorney at the New York City Commission for Human Rights and a public defender and immigrant defense attorney at Brooklyn Defender Services. She clerked at the Constitutional Court of South Africa for Justices Albie Sachs and Edwin Cameron. In addition, Ting Ting was a Fulbright Scholar to South Africa, where she received the Amy Beale Award. Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist and author. She has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment Magazine since 2004 and is the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine's most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Ting Ting Cheng and Nadine Epstein.
I'm Nadine, and this week marks the second anniversary of Justice Ginsburg's death. And we wanted to do something to truly honor her memory. And so we're starting the Road to Gender Equity series. Life takes us on unexpected journeys, and writing a book with Justice Ginsburg in what turned out to be the last year of her life was one of mine. And it's led to another journey, which has been talking about women, the women in the book, and about Justice Ginsburg for the last year, and thinking a lot about where the gender equity movement in the United States is going. During this last year, I've talked to thousands of people of all ages, inside and outside of the progressive box, and conservatives, and all different, just so many different kinds of people. As editor of Moment, I'm in touch with many parts of the Jewish community, the whole country. I once covered rural America. I covered the US-Mexico border. I live in a lot of different parts of the country and the world. I meet a lot of people, and I listen to a lot of people. And I have had a few takeaways. One is that there's a tremendous complacency about women's movement in the United States. When I talk to young people, a lot of them have no clue that women today don't have the same rights as men. And really, vast majority of people I talk to think, well, you know, except for Roe versus Wade, we have a lot of gender equity. So in the United States, so there's a lot of complacency. I always hear, oh, well, you know, we have Title IX. It's so much more than we used to have. Well, it's true. We have a lot more than we used to have, but we do not yet have what we need, which is true gender equity in this country. So I've started this quest, and I call it the Road to Gender Equity, because I believe that gender equity is critical for the United States, and that it's really critical, us having it is critical for the rest of the world. And I want to know what we can do to create the change necessary to move the gender equity movement forward. Well, how do we get to the place in this country where women are not reliant on political wins and workaround rulings and laws? How can we get a constitutional amendment to protect women's rights? Even though the vast majority of people in the United States want women to have equal rights and believe that, we are a deeply polarized and divided society, and the women's movement, as we think of it, is very siloed, it's fragmented, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And some of its issues and language are very polarizing. So politics are very important, and working today to get more women in politics and leadership is critical, but it's not the focus here in this conversation, because our political system is frozen right now. Rather, I want to focus on what needs to be done to create the social change, the linguistic change, the educational change, the legal change, whatever change is necessary to unify the movement and strengthen it so that we can all work together to create the change we need in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. I have invited as my first guest a brilliant civil rights lawyer who's focused on gender, and she's the mother of young children, and has her own ideas, and I want to learn from them and think things through with her. And a heads up, you're joining us for an experiment. I'm doing something a little different here. I'm trying to get a conversation going in a new direction. It's the first in a series of conversations that will end next year with, I hope, a list of strategy points. So bear with me as we explore and learn together, even if at times you hear something you disagree with. And warning, there might be things that I say or someone else says that are not politically correct, but that's okay because we have to be able to think and to talk freely, And also, since this is an experiment and not even a regular Moment Live program, I want you to start thinking right now about what you think we need to do to create the changes needed to get a constitutional amendment, whether it's our current ERA or a new one called QXY in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, based on your own life experiences and your own thinking. I'd like you to put your thoughts in the chat so we can learn from you. And also, please send them to me at editor@momentmag.com. It's editor@momentmag.com. I will read every single one of them. So now I'm so happy to be in conversation with Ting Ting. And so Ting Ting, I just thought I'd start by a really basic question. Why do you think gender equity is necessary in the United States?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Nadine. It's just such a pleasure and an honor to be in conversation with you and to be joined by everybody here today. And I love your call to action, because at the end of the day, what we talk about is deeply personal and important to our lives and our communities. And I think, the conversation around the ERA is exactly about that. So thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to just take a chance to talk a little bit about the ERA project, if I may. We were founded a little under a year and a half ago to develop expert legal guidance on the ratification of the ERA to the US Constitution and to establish a broader framework for gender equity that we envision in this country. We've written and published in-depth legal analysis, white papers, policy briefs to educate judges, advocates, members of Congress, White House staff, and the media. And I encourage you to check out our website. And I believe that that information will be shared with everybody after this conversation. So yeah, why do we need it? Well, I guess I'd like to start from the beginning, which is that our founding document, the Constitution, when it was drafted at the time, was very flawed. The people who drafted the Constitution intentionally, explicitly left out gender protections, and also the protections of most people in this country. And it was an act of holding on to and strengthening power of the very small percentage of people who own land and who are white and who are male in this country. So at a very fundamental level, I think that the quest and this road to gender equality using the ERA as a tool is just foundational to the founding of this country and needs to speak to where we are today. I also think that we're in a kind of a moment of constitutional crisis. It's scary. There are rights that we have relied on that have been in the Constitution for the last 50 years, which are under threat or have been completely obliterated. This is extremely rare and something that most people did not think would ever happen. And so if we were to take a look at the Constitution as sort of setting the floor, setting the very basis of rights and ethics that we all abide by in this country, sort of like, unquestioned rights, it has to include gender equality. The fact that it doesn't have that currently, and the fact that we're dealing with a political system, a Supreme Court that's, at the ready to dismantle these fundamental rights is scary. We can't change the core, but we can change the text of the Constitution. We can change what they interpret and what they implement in this moment. And the ERA would do a lot to protect these rights that we're, that are under threat right now.
So Polly Murray, who is a brilliant legal strategist,
genius,
and a genius, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was another
genius.
They used the 14th Amendment during the 70s to basically create a workaround for women's rights based on the 14th Amendment. And she always thought of it as a workaround. What is the downside of basically having our rights as women be founded on the 14th Amendment?
That's an amazing question. I think a lot of people who oppose the ERA sort of one of their go-to comments is, well, why do we need it? Isn't it already in the Constitution? Or through the work of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other people like Polly Murray, don't we have something called a de facto ERA? Meaning, haven't we gotten to a place where we've, through the genius of these people, gotten the Supreme Court to acknowledge that the 14th Amendment actually also applies in the gender context beyond the race context, right?
Mhm.
And it's not enough. And I think that the 14th Amendment also, the way that it's been interpreted in the recent decades, has really been used as a tool to undermine equality, unfortunately. One example that I can point to is that, during this horrific crisis of the pandemic, President Biden created a kind of like infrastructure bill that was meant to give some financial support to owners of businesses, restaurants. And part of this bill, it wasn't to give certain people more money. It was only to expedite the check. So for people who are from a historically marginalized group, so women, people of color who are business owners and restaurant owners, they would get their stimulus check a little faster than other people. So this provision of the infrastructure plan was challenged in the Sixth Circuit. And the judge in that case basically used the 14th Amendment as a sword in that case to sort of say, well, you can't create these provisions that treat people differently based on their gender. And so therefore, this provision that is meant to help people who have historically been disadvantaged and marginalized and perhaps in a worse place as a result of the pandemic, you can't treat them differently and you can't favor them in any way in our law. So the 14th Amendment has been used in the race context and also in the gender context to basically strike down measures that would affirmatively help people who have historically been marginalized. And so that doesn't help people. And this kind of viewpoint of the 14th Amendment as one of formal equality, meaning blind to race or blind to gender, is also blind to the inequalities in our systems, in our laws, and our infrastructure that has gotten us to this place of inequality, right? And so being blind to inequality when looking at laws is in a way an undermining of equality moving forward. So I don't think that the 14th Amendment is enough. And I think that we need a different way of thinking about equality. I think in other countries, they have adopted equality models that are a lot more robust, a lot more substantive, not just in terms of we protect, individual people from government action, from government laws that are meant to interfere with their rights. Rather, we see equality as the government has an affirmative obligation to support people, to restore people to a place of equality that they, have historically has been taken from them. So I think the ERA is very different from the 14th Amendment in that regard and has the potential to go beyond the 14th Amendment in ways that are, incredibly beneficial for most people in this country, I would say.
Well, we're going to go back to that in a minute. But first, because there's a lot to talk about what should be an ERA or what the ERA actually does. But so Justice Ginsburg thought that having a constitutional amendment ensuring women's rights was critical, but she felt that the current ERA should be set aside and we should push for a new one. She thought that the ratification process for the ERA was too complicated legally to be ratified. And I don't want to go too far on this, but I know because you work on this project and from talking to you that you actually disagree with her and that you do think there's a chance. So why do you think that the current ERA, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, like what it is really, has a chance when she disagreed with that?
Yeah. So just to start, I'm at Columbia Law School and it is sort of the home of RBG. And so when I'm walking around the law school, I feel like her spirit is kind of infused into the building. And it's just, incredible to feel that. And also we put on a lot of programs and we have all these posters of her all over, and Professor Jane Ginsburg sits upstairs from us. So her spirit is around us. And I think it's really interesting, those two comments, she made those comments twice where she said, well, I think it's probably a lot better to just start over. It's just, where the ERA has landed in the political mess that it's in is way too complicated. And she's right. The last amendment to be added to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, we call the Madison Amendments. It was proposed by James Madison by the first Congress. It took over 200 years to be ratified by 38 states. It governs congressional pay raises, really not a huge matter of public policy. I don't think anyone's going to spend any time litigating the validity of that amendment, but I think that there will be people who will spend their lifetimes challenging the ERA in courts. So I think in that regard, I understand where she's coming from. It's a little unfortunate with the timing, because when she made those statements, we were just so incredibly close. That was after Virginia's 38th ratification of the ERA. And on a pragmatic level, it really felt like there's so much momentum, right, in this kind of revitalization project of the ERA that I think her statement really went up against. I mean, I think that it's, she certainly wasn't speaking in her capacity as a judge. And I also think that her career as an appellate lawyer and as a constitutional lawyer and scholar, and then also a judge on the Supreme Court, that's very different than, I think, the mindset of an advocate or the mindset of somebody doing kind of like strategic litigation on the ground level. And that speaks to the array of strategies that everyone's kind of engaging with all at once, and how all of those different strategies and the different viewpoints can all come together to form some kind of forward trajectory, right? Rather than going backwards, or rather than creating some chaos. So I do think that the idealist in me is like, yes, there's a world out there where we write an ERA that's very modern. And we talk about the ERA and the movement for modern equality that's reflective of this modern language that we can all write today, right? But at the same time, the ERA has passed all the constitutional requirements, the requirements under Article 5, 2/3 of Congress need to approve it. Done. 38 state legislatures need to ratify it. Done. Incredibly difficult. So now that we are here in this moment, I almost feel like we are so incredibly close to the finishing line. We can touch it. Now we're just doing this kind of additional work of creating these constitutional moments to gain a broad acceptance of the ERA. I also want to see the ERA in the Constitution and also meaningfully enforced in my lifetime. And so that also cuts against, Justice Ginsburg's words, but I guess I see it from multiple perspectives.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you in a minute, but not right yet. What would a modern constitutional amendment, we might call it the QXY amendment. What would the QXY amendment say that the current one wouldn't? But hold off on that question. I'm going to ask you first. I want to ask you one more question. So the ERA is not like a magic pill that we all take and it just magically transforms the country. What about like having first of all, a constitutional amendment? What does it do for us as women or for the nation? And what does it not do? Let's start with that. And then I'm going to go to the second question is, what would a new one do? So let's start with that. What does it do and what does it not do? Like the current one, even.
Well, to start, it's a constitutional amendment. And so the Constitution is a collection of principles, if you will, that are enshrined. And so to enshrine sex equality explicitly in the Constitution is to sort of change the way that we sort of see our democracy in this moment. I know that sounds very vague, but all this is to
vague
say
is
that
okay. No, principles. This vague is okay. We're
principles.
We're not in court right now. We can be vague.
It's not a statute. It's a principle that orients the democracy, meaning it's up to us to interpret what something like this means. Now, you raised the 14th Amendment, right? I don't know if the ERA is worth fighting for if all we're doing is trying to create just like a gender-specific 14th Amendment. I think we just have to go beyond that. But as a principle, I think we need to understand it as something that can have broad sweeping sort of change that impacts most of our institutions, our laws and policies. The part of the ERA that most people know is the provision that says that, no state shall deny or abridge person's equality based on the basis of sex. But there are other provisions in there that are also equally important. The provision that says that Congress has the power to implement this, right? That gives Congress an incredible amount of power to legislate and to create laws that could bring about more gender equality. So those are some of the things that will come about because of the ERA being in the Constitution. I also think that as we are kind of just in emergency mode right now, trying to, we work a lot with people, organizations on the ground, doing some of the defensive work. A lot is happening, a lot is changing. It's very kind of unpredictable, especially in the area of reproductive rights. But at the same time, I think of the ERA as a foundational change to this country as something that would empower advocates and change the way that they litigate, change the way that lawmakers conceive of different laws that can implement gender equality. There's a real opportunity to think differently, to think creatively. I think that all of that opportunity and energy comes with changing a foundational document and adding some sort of ethics
So
that just is missing.
We passed the ERA and a lot more things have to happen. Basically, it's what happens. It doesn't change the world. It is very important in terms of principle. It's very important in terms of ethics, but there's still a lot of work that has to be done once we passed this ERA.
I think that I think when we pass the ERA, I think there's a lot of not substantive, substantive, but maybe just a little bit more surface level changes that will immediately go into effect. And that is just a sweeping survey of existing laws and policies, and also policies within agencies and institutions from the government. There just needs to be a leveling up of equality based on gender that has to happen throughout states and with the federal government. That's huge. And I think that's why, when the ERA was written, it allowed for a 2-year period where the ERA, from the point of final ratification to when it becomes in effect, there's a 2-year period where the idea was to get the federal government and the state governments to kind of get up to speed with the requirements of the ERA. So that would create a lot of transformational change. But I think we just need to think differently about what equality means, what people who are suffering today, who lack basic equality, and also who this constitutional amendment is for. Is it for people who actually have a lot of privilege and resources and for whom the ERA wouldn't really change their lives? Or how do we get it to be implemented by Congress, by state legislatures, to actually impact the people for whom, who would benefit the most from an ERA in the Constitution? I think that's a really rich democracy project that requires everyone to think differently about our existing Constitution, our existing systems, and to critique it using an ERA to empower them.
So we're going to get to that in a minute. It's a really important point. So let's say ERA never gets ratified, or this ERA doesn't get ratified. What would a different, like, if you could, let's go back to your question. If we were going to reword the ERA, maybe call it QXY for modern times, what would you like to see in it? Just a few thoughts.
It's interesting because I've worked on the Nevada state ERA, which is now going to be on the ballot this midterm, and also the New York state ERA. And in both proposed state ERAs that are going to be added to the Constitution, in New York, it's attained first passage in the state legislatures and has to do it one more time, and then it'll be put to the voters in New York. Both of these state level ERAs are expansive and have broad language. So beyond just gender equality, also covering race, disability, reproductive rights, abortion. So I don't necessarily think that we need specifically something like that enumerates all these different categories in order for an ERA to be successful. I actually think that if it's broadly worded, and by the way, the ERA does not mention the word women. So in that regard, it kind of applies to everybody, right? what I'd like to see is something that reflects our modern times, meaning if we were to flatten everyone's experiences just by one single identity or one category, gender, right? Setting aside all of these other linked identities that we're all experiencing all at once, then the movement necessarily is going to be led by the people who are the most advantaged, right? The people who have the most resources. And so the needs of the most well-resourced people are going to rise above everybody else's. So I'd like to see a modern ERA that takes into account the intersecting experiences of women, of gender minorities, of a lot of different people for whom their sex and their gender somehow dictate the way in which our laws and our systems like control them or have a say in how they live their lives. So, that could be a different way of kind of like implementing it. But I'd like to, that's to me what a modern ERA would encompass.
So also it would be, I saw you speaking in a video once where you talked about how your goal is to help build an inclusive, intersectional, and interdisciplinary ERA movement. So the movement to get the ERA should be different also. And that, so you're looking for more people to be involved, which brings me to the next thing is that really, the ERA came out of, well, I know it started in 1920, but earlier, but really our current ERA comes out of the 1970s. And there's so much about the language of that women's movement, which deeply, impacted me, even though I was too young to be part of it, but deeply impacted me, and it's definitely impacted so many. But that language is often very divisive, and it doesn't really resonate with lots of people. And particularly, it doesn't resonate with younger generations. So, who think in terms of gender equity as opposed to women's equity. And that's not the only thing. That's just very one example. So like, we need to think about how we're going to change the language, the nomenclature as well. And maybe we should step back a little bit though here, because like in your mind, what is the difference between gender equity and women's equity? They are not exactly the same. And does the current ERA cover both? Or do we need to reframe? If we were able to ideally reframe the whole thing, could we reframe the language in a different way?
Mm-hmm. I think the current language leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And luckily, we have a couple of tools in that regard. Coming from the Supreme Court, in 2020, in the Bostock case, the Supreme Court interpreted the word sex to also encompass beyond sex, gender identity, gender expression. So this means that sex also applies to, transgender people and also queer people and people who don't identify with either and who live, and who have like multiple layers of existence, right, on the spectrum of gender and sex. So the Supreme Court has spoken about that, which is great, which means that the ERA, the definition of sex in the ERA is actually very broad, which is a good thing. I think that the problem that you point to, which is a real one, is that all of this just needs a lot of kind of rebranding, retooling, a lot of education. And we're in a moment where, well, there's a kind of a threat to education. There's this, I think a part of this like huge long-term right-wing agenda has been to topple Roe, but now it's also to kind of like get at critical race theory and the ways in which like history in America is being taught. And I mean, I meet people who go to law school, they've never heard about the ERA, let alone people who are in middle school. And I work a lot with an organization of very young people who started called Generation Ratified. They founded the organization to advocate for the ERA when they were teenagers, when they were 15.
Yes, I know them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so inspiring. And they really have their finger on the pulse. But when we, talk to other young people or when they're doing kind of like on the ground advocacy, everybody's a little bit confused. Like, wait, what? Hang on, we don't have an ERA. There isn't equal rights in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So at a very basic level, that kind of conversation is missing. And
That's
then
why
at
we're
the,
having this project. That's why that's
yes,
the whole point of this project, is to find some of that conversation and create that conversation, because everyone's kind of stuck we're
yeah,
all kind of stuck and also very siloed.
and
And some
very
people are
siloed
having a
and busy.
conversation, yeah, and busy, but somehow we have, this is my question. So how do we create a larger and more unified community around gender equity in the United States? Right now, it's not in it's, I mean, it does include language change. It does include, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How do we do that? It's the movement. And um, do you have some thoughts on that? And you don't have to have, I mean, I know this isn't what you normally are talking about or thinking about, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can speak specifically through the lens of the ERA. And I kind of have two responses to that. One has to do with the fact that so many people of color and queer people have contributed to the movement of the ERA. You know, it's a 100-year movement, really. It was first proposed to Congress. I'll just give you guys kind of like a quick background. In 1923, following the heels of the success of the suffrage movement, so the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And the idea was that the 19th Amendment is a starting point. Now that, you know, women have the right to vote, although not all women have the right to vote, even today. There's a lot of voter disenfranchisement, but, you know, certainly the viewpoint is that the 19th Amendment is a starting point. Now we need something that's can broadly deliver on the promise of equality, now that there's kind of like political enfranchisement through something like the ERA. So it was first proposed in 1923. 50 years go by and Congress finally approves it, you know, and with overwhelming bipartisan support. I think 8 senators voted against the ERA at that time. You know, everybody was just so excited about it. People thought that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. What's the interesting historical fact here? That Hawaii, on the same day that the Senate approved the ERA, also ratified the ERA. It was the first state to do so, and was able to do so because of the huge time difference. You know, there just was so much momentum for the women's movement at that moment. And then it was stalled. There was a kind of a counter ERA movement. We can go into that as well. But, you know, it takes another 50 years to gain that kind of requisite 38 state ratification of the ERA, culminating in the last 3 states that finally were able to ratify the ERA in, you know, in Nevada and Illinois and Virginia in 2020.
I don't want to spend too much time on the history because I want to focus on the future.
Yeah. But back
So,
to your question, a lot of women of color and also queer women, Pat Spearman, who's a
mhm.
lesbian Black senator in Nevada, were instrumental, led the revitalization of the ERA movement from 2017 onward, basically. I mean, a lot of people thought that it was, you know, it was dead. And the people who revived it and the people who continue to give it a lot of meaning and a lot of modern context are people of color. So there's a lack of acknowledgement of the already existing contributions. You bring up Polly Murray, and Polly is an incredible contributor to the meaning of the ERA. But, you know, I would say like is the most incredible genius in our history that nobody's ever heard of. So, and then moving forward, I think that there has to be a perspective where how we talk about our existing institutions and why we need the ERA also has to do with acknowledging that our laws and our institutions have been set up to advantage and to favor white people and also white women. And so in that regard, you get a lot of results. Like, you know, perhaps women have been disadvantaged because of their gender, but also white women have been advantaged because of their race, right? And so how do you involve other people in this conversation about equality going forward, so that we're not just, again, replicating the same institutions of power
Got it.
with the same kind of breakdown?
I understand. So do you, and I want, we have only a little bit of time left and I have a bunch of questions I want to ask you. So
Yes.
first of all, and very briefly, do you really think we have a chance, there's a chance to pass the ERA, this current ERA? Just briefly.
It depends on what you think, where do you think we are? I think that, how do I put it? I think that the ERA is here to stay. Maybe that should be our motto. It's just, it's, it's satisfied all constitutional requirements under Article 5. That's incredibly difficult, Some scholars and
there's
some
legal debate about, there's a debate about
there's a
that,
debate.
though.
There's definitely a debate. And we
Yeah.
have
I mean, many
talked about the
people I
debate.
know.
We've written about the debate.
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
time limit, there's a deadline, there's issues of rescission. There are lots of legal
Yes,
questions
those
that
are,
have
yeah.
never been resolved by the Supreme Court, and that history doesn't really instruct us on what to do. So in that sense, they're novel questions. But at the same time, I mean, we are confronted with the question of, what do we do with these issues, these legal issues that we need to resolve, not whether the ERA is going to be in the Constitution or not. I think that we're so close that now the question is, how do we resolve these legal questions that are novel, that people don't really have the answer to, in
Whether
order
or not
to,
there's an ERA or not.
Yeah, there's an ERA.
So if there's an
38,
ERA,
how about
we
this?
still need to
38
resolve the same
states.
questions. We need to resolve the same questions.
We need to resolve these questions, but also 38 states have spoken to sort of say, we want this in our Constitution. Now, some states, a handful of states, have voted to rescind their previous ratifications of the ERA, but that doesn't have any historical precedent. We've never acknowledged those, and granted, the Reconstruction was a different time, but some states try to rescind the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court was like, no, we're just going to ignore you, right? So,
okay, but our Supreme Court we have now might not ignore this, but absolutely. So no, that's a really important point that you're making. I want to just switch tracks a little bit, because, I really see, this as a social change movement. And it's not just the push for an ERA, it's a push for gender equity, however it can be gotten. And it may not be gotten right now. It could be gotten. We need to be thinking about, as I've said, in the future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years now, 20 years from now. Social change takes time. And there's been a lot of social change from a conservative vantage point in the United States. A lot of that's been done very strategically. But there's actually, a movement that happened really relatively rapidly and very successfully. And that was the same-sex marriage movement. And I just was wondering, is there something that we can learn from the same-sex marriage movement? Is there one lesson we can take away from that in your opinion? And if you don't have to have an answer, I have some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts, actually, but I was going to say, we've written a lot about kind of the interconnectedness between different movements, the relationship between the ERA and something like the Equality Act, and also why there's a lot more sort of like political will to protect same-sex marriage right now, rather than, let's say, abortion after Dobbs. So, I mean, the one thing to learn from these movements is that we need to reinforce these equality movements to strengthen, right, the backbone of equality in this country. These things that we're fighting for are mutually reinforcing. And so we just need to make sure that we come together, respect each other's movements, but also move forward, in the spirit of collaboration and to strengthen what we have together. This is
I would say that it really has to do with the social change movement. It's not just like these movements are all connected. To me, one of the lessons that we learn is that movement was not only, but men were very involved in that movement. And it wasn't, there were definitely women involved in the movement, but men were very involved in it. And if you look at even the suffrage movement in the United States, how did the 19th Amendment get passed? Well, really, there's this guy named Harry Burns, and he's a 22-year-old, and he's in Tennessee, and his mom writes him, he's not going to vote for the ERA to ratify, so Tennessee isn't going to ratify it, but his mom writes him a letter, and he then votes for it. So I think that one of the things that we learned from this movement, from the same-sex marriage movement, and also we learned from the whole movement in the 18th century, is that men have to be deeply involved. And that's one way to create a larger and more unified community around getting to gender equity in the United States.
Absolutely. And I think that after Dobbs, I think that the Supreme Court has signaled to us that it's just the beginning and that there are other fundamental rights that are perhaps on the chopping block, So this is an opportunity, especially given the Supreme Court's interpretation of the definition of sex to also include orientation and identity and things like that, for us to all get behind the ERA, including men, right?
But I think there has to be a lot of work done before we can get there. I think it's not like, a lot of the connections that you're talking about are occurring only in the most progressive parts of the progressive community. And we have to be thinking in a much bigger picture, which then leads me to another question, which is, there are a lot of people out there who are convinced, women's rights, really, it's just, we have enough. It's all done. We're in a post-feminist, you've heard, we were in a post-racist era and we're in a post-feminist era. And so, what do you say to people who, and there are lots of people I know, my age, younger, all ages, and men too, and a lot, women especially, who go, hey, we have enough, we have Title IX. My kids get to, I got to play on a softball team. I got to do this. I have a credit card in my name. I can own property now. I have enough. We have enough. This isn't worth arguing about. What do you say? And they're post-feminists. They're all enjoying the benefits of feminism, but they're post-feminists and they don't realize there's more to it. What do you think we can say to them?
I think that I look around me and it's clear that we are in a moment of crisis and people are, really suffering. People are dying, for many different reasons. And I think that in a moment of crisis like this, from what I've seen, using the pandemic as an example, women have been the backbone. Women have been the backbone as essential workers, as caregivers, as engines of the economy, although then it's caused a huge resignation, right? And so I think that I don't think anyone's going to argue that point. And at the same time, if we were to take a clear viewpoint of our institutions, our laws, our policies, the people who get left out the most, the people who are the least protected are women. While they're working, while they're studying, while they're going to school, while they're, pregnant. So in all different facets of a woman's existence. So how do you square those two things? And I would challenge people to kind of have that moment of yes, there's an emotional feeling connected to your own safety or connected to your own resources, your community, right? It's hard to critique yourself. It's hard to sort of say hang on, what's this patriarchal society that's in? I'm being oppressed. That's hard. But at the same time, I think looking around us and just engaging with the reality, engaging with actual pain is a fruitful way of acknowledging that we need women's rights. We need explicit constitutional protections. We need basic foundational changes in our constitution that the ERA would start to do.
It would be wonderful if that really spoke to people, but it's not clear to me that that's enough to speak to people.
Yeah.
And even it doesn't do enough to speak to people who are post-feminists. And it doesn't seem to really, that argument, even though obviously rules really impact them, doesn't actually speak to people who are convinced that, women's rights or, abortion rights are really leading the country in the wrong direction. And now now we all understand that most people, if you talk to them, all agree that women should have all the same rights as men. Very few people will disagree. But yet, we do not yet, and this is not something we can solve today, but I feel like one of the points of this project, so keep thinking about it, everyone, is what kind of language can we use to make this conversation not just inclusive in the progressive community, but in even the less progressives, not that they're part of the progressive community, but they're less progressive. And then the people who don't consider them, who are just moderates, and then people who are not moderates. I think we need to have a lot of language that we think through. And I have one more question for you before I know we have to go, because we have so many questions that people asked. But I was wondering if are there any lessons that you learned? I mean, Justice Ginsburg would be incredibly proud of your work, and she would be thrilled that there's a project, maybe she even knew that there's a project like this at Columbia, and that you were somebody who was leading it. are there any lessons, if any, that you've learned from Justice Ginsburg that you take with you that I think are important for this, our conversation about women's rights in the country?
Oh, I just want to, this is so touching. Yeah, I mean, she's, she was a legal force. And I think that she had this really incredible strategy when advancing gender equality in the Constitution and in our laws to bring everybody along. And I think that that speaks to your point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that at the end of the day, it's not really about ideology. It's about appealing to people and how they see themselves and what fundamental justice is. I think part of her strategy in the beginning, when she was litigating all of those sex equality cases in the 70s, was to appeal to the justices on the court. I think that's a strategy to get them on board, but that's a strategy also to make sure that, when we move forward, it's not divisive. It's meant to up level everybody's equality.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And when she was picking cases to litigate, she was picking cases that men cared about, that had men as the victims, and it wasn't about women. And I feel like that is a lesson that we need to take forward. That was one of the reasons she was successful, and that's one of the reasons she was a unique legal thinker. And we have to take that lesson forward and think about how to apply it now, because then it speaks beyond, our core audience. So that's really a wonderful thought. I'm gonna let Suzanne take over now and ask some of the questions that we have, that all of you have sent.
Thank you both for that wonderful, wonderful conversation. I did want to just start by saying that somebody wrote and said they think it's a mistake to start over. Let's get the existing amendment, which already met all the ratification requirements, into the Constitution, and then work on Congress to pass laws to implement this according to current situations. And somebody else who agreed with that as well and says they're a 40-plus-year member of the League of Women Voters that helped lead the push for the ERA.
Amazing.
Do you think that it's time to encourage everyone to write their representatives to move, to get their representatives to remove the time limit for which the artificial ratification time was supposed to be done? And so that's just their comments. Do you work with the League of Women Voters was the question.
I don't work very closely with them, but we are in coalition, spaces a lot. I see them a lot on ERA coalition calls, and if anyone has any suggestions for partners or people that we should be engaging with further, definitely reach out to me. I'm very much about the partnerships.
Mm-hmm. And on the flip side, someone wrote and said the ERA was written decades ago. We need something with teeth. So we definitely have people who have varying opinions on this. Going back to the 14th Amendment, with all the new voter suppression laws being set forth, the 14th Amendment does not seem to be even working for race now. Do you have a comment on that?
I would agree with that assessment. Unfortunately, I don't think the 14th Amendment was originally written with this intention in mind. It was a part of the Reconstruction Amendments. It was meant to fully restore people to full citizenship that they were deprived of under the institution of slavery. And today, it's the kind of race equality model that's been implemented under the 14th Amendment is very much one of formalism, and it's about just, if I get an orange, you get an orange. I just don't think that you can treat people like that. And I think that it's not about formal equality. It's about looking at where we are and assessing where we need to be and how the laws can be a corrective for that. There's a much more nimble, a much more individualized viewpoint of looking at equality. And unfortunately, it has been, the example that I talked about in the beginning of our talk, that happens a lot. It's been happening in the past couple of decades, and it's unfortunately been used as a tool to undermine equality, I think, in a really unfortunate way.
Thank you.
I have another question too, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, there are so many groups out there, groups that were founded centuries ago, groups that were founded in the 70s, groups that were founded decades ago, or recent groups, and they're working on different parts of the feminist project. I see them as very siloed, and even though they might talk to each other, they have so many different missions, and groups have their own agendas. Do you perceive that?
Do I perceive that there are many
That there's
groups?
that these groups that really there's almost so many groups out there that, one, it's confusing, and two, that yes, maybe they're on some calls together and coalitions, but really, is there really, really, is there even a core of the feminist movement today? There's just no core. It seems to me just to be a bunch of, a lot of different organizations who claim little parts of it, and who have their own groups and followings that, they have done something important. They feel like they're doing something important, but it's not clear to me that the movement is a whole at this point. And maybe it never was, but it feels like at certain times it did have more, a little bit more cohesiveness to it. And I just wondered if you felt that same way.
I think about it all the time, because I think that there's a lot of pressure put on the women's rights movement to unite and to all get along. And I think that it's a matter of, it's about kind of like the arc of history and these pendulum swings. I think that it's one of those, like, united against a common enemy type of thing, right? It's like, I think what happened after the Trump election was that there was a huge unity, and that's happened throughout history. And I'm not a historian, but I think that the missed opportunity with all of these moments for transformational change that grounds gender equality is that afterwards these movements disperse, or afterwards there's a disagreement about who is leading and what kind of agenda needs to be advanced, because they lack that kind of like multi-issue, intersectional, multi-generational kind of like coming together afterwards. There's a gelling that doesn't happen afterwards. In terms of the ERA movement, it's really interesting. There's so many incredible people that I work with that I learned so much from, who were part of the movement in the 70s, and they saw it all happening. And sometimes the strategies can be a little different. They are focusing a lot on what the archivist is going to do. Who's this administrator? There's going to be a new archivist, Colleen Shogun. Her hearing is actually on Wednesday, for those of you who want to tune into that. But, a lot of people are putting emphasis on the archivist and on these different strategies, and that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, we need to figure out the meaning of the ERA. We need to make sure that we are getting judges ready to interpret the ERA in a feminist way. We want lawmakers to implement policies that are trying to do something new and be helpful, that's different from the institution. So that's what kind of we are doing at the ERA project. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of hope at the state level. And I also want to plug the fact that there are 26 states with state level ERAs. So there's no debate about isn't it in the constitution of the state. It's in the state constitution. A lot of them have been actually underutilized. It's an incredible opportunity in this moment, both to get judges to implement them and kind of like implement equality and bring in equality arguments in broader ways, and also to get state level executives like mayors and attorney generals and governors to really take these tools and to implement it in a modern way. So that's something that we work a lot on.
I have one more question, and we can maybe go over a couple minutes here. So what if the new archivist this new archivist or another archivist, because I'm sure it will be a very interesting hearing, since this archivist has some task before him or her that is, bigger than a normal archivist tasks. And it has a lot of political ramifications. So what if this archivist says, okay, I agree. We should have the ERA and what happens next?
The most concrete thing that will happen is starting from that moment, all new constitutions that are printed by the government will list the ERA as the 28th Amendment.
That's a pretty big
So
thing.
that's huge. It's a huge symbolic move. It means that any kid that gets a constitution in the library and opens it up will be like, oh yeah, the 28th Amendment, it just it changes reality, I think, for people in a way that's really symbolic and really important. Now, is that kind of action going to have any legal effect on the way that the ERA gets interpreted by judges? No, because the archivist is a purely administrative position who rubber stamps. I mean, they're a very important librarian of the federal government, but they are meant to just kind of record ratifications as they come in. And once the constitutional standard has been met, they certify and they publish the ERA. That action, which is the source of the, pending litigation right now, that's before the First Circuit. Also oral arguments at the end of September if people want to tune into the action. But both sides agreed that kind of act by the archivist has a lot of symbolic meaning, but it won't have any legal effect on the actual validity of the ERA. That's going to be something that the courts have to decide.
So it's going to set off, in fact, already the litigation has begun, but if that happens, it'll take us to a new kind of, or maybe it already has started, a new kind of litigation, right?
It might kick up other forms of political dust. Yes.
Political dust.
So
yes.
Let me get to a few more questions here. One is, you mentioned that 26 states have their own ERAs in their state constitutions. So is that a place where people who are living in states that do not have the constitutions can put some effort into in trying to create that for their states?
Yeah. And there's actually, people sort of say, oh, constitutions are so hard to amend. Nobody cares about constitutional reform. But I mean, there are 5 states that are currently in the process of amending their state constitutions with an ERA. We know that Nevada, that process has been done by the legislature. It's going to go before the voters very soon, in a month. New York is in the process of passing. They've secured first passage of a very broad ERA. And in 3 other states, in Maine and Vermont and in Minnesota, at least one chamber of the state government has voted to approve a state level ERA and has held hearings. And I think that the momentum to do that in other states will grow.
So there's 26 that have already passed it completely, and then a few more in the works. 5
with
more
a state
in the works.
level. Mm-hmm.
So
Utah has one of the oldest.
Utah, very interesting state. With a very interesting history. Yes, it's a very
one of the oldest ERAs.
And if people are living in a state that has not ratified something for their own state constitution, where is a place to direct them? How do they find out how they could get involved, or they have to? Is it something like contacting the League of Women Voters, or where do people get started with that?
They can check out our website. They can contact us and we can put them in touch. I think with the project of amending a state constitution, it really takes a lot of effort and a lot of will at the state level. And, we have been working both in New York and Nevada in those processes, but we're there to kind of like offer our expertise as needed. It really is up to people on the ground and in the state to create that momentum. And it takes people in the legislature who are really, have the appetite for that kind of thing, right? And people on the ground, organizations have been set up in the states that I've mentioned to, create impact and push the needle forward. So I think for people who are interested in that, like, definitely reach out to us just to get a grounding and to see if we can put you in touch. And I think that there's a lot of interesting opportunities for that kind of coalition building moving forward. I mean, I love a surprise, a good one. So I'd love to hear that, in Mississippi, there's going to be a coalition to ratify the ERA in the state constitution. I think it's possible.
Which brings me to my second to last question. And then Nadine, I'll hand it back to you if you want to do any kind of wrap up. Someone would like to know, are there any political leaders who are making this a priority, passing the ERA in our Constitution?
Well, I would say in the Senate, there's definitely Senator Cardin. I mean, I think I think most people are interested in working toward lifting that time limit. Unfortunately, we have the filibuster, which presents a huge obstacle to getting the 60 votes in the Senate. But I think that there are lots of people in the state legislatures that are really committed to the ERA. Pat Spearman, Jennifer McClellan, who's a Virginia senator. I think that there's an opportunity in the House actually for new and maybe younger leadership to step up.
Because
Since
Carol Maloney just is
yes,
not going to be there. Yes.
yes, and also Representative Jackie Spears also stepping down.
Oh, both of them are. Okay. Yeah.
So there's a real opening for new and younger leadership in the House to step up and to make ERA one of their main priorities.
Which actually brings me to the last question. If you have any last words, inspiring words for younger, say college students and teens who in their life right now, they're concerned about gun violence, they're concerned about abortion rights, they're concerned about student debt, and this does not seem to register with them. What would be your plea to young women in terms of the importance of them getting involved in yet another issue?
I think that this is a democracy project for which they are the key players. And whether they are pursuing other things because of different places and where they are in their lives, or kind of the different messages that they've been given through their education systems or through their culture, their environment, that doesn't change the fact that they are the key actors in this multi-generational movement for fundamental equality in this country. How do I get that message to them is a different question, but I see them as the people who are going to lead the charge. No one else is going to do it. And I think they are going to do it in their own unique ways. And I want to hear from them. I want to hear how they want to do it. It's a creative task. It's collaborative, it's multi-generational, and it's empowering. And so I want these young women to step into the fold.
Great, thank you. And while Nadine wraps up, if you'd like to put in the chat or into the Q&A and send it to everybody, your website, that would be great.
Yes.
Just so everybody knows that we will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain a link to today's session, as well as a link to Ting Ting's website. But Nadine, if there's any wrap up you would like to do.
So we will be talking to historians and also to some of the young leaders of movements who are working towards a constitutional amendment, and many other people over the next few months. So, and they're all going to be somewhat spontaneous conversations, and probably similar to this one. But I just want to thank, first of all, Ting Ting, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm so grateful. I learned so much from listening to you, and thank you for thinking things through with us. And I know I took you down some lanes of questions that you don't normally you aren't normally asked to go down, but thank you for following along and sharing all these ideas. I'm so grateful for that. This is our first conversation, and thank you to all of you for being so interested to be here, and for caring, and for continuing this conversation, and for sending your ideas, not just in the chat, but also to me, to Nadine Epstein at editor@momentmag.com. And if you have suggestions of people you think that we should be talking to in this project, I'm open to all of your ideas as well, because there are so many different interesting people out there, and we want to learn from as many as we can. So again, thank you.
And thank you, Nadine and Suzanne, for having this conversation, and also for, trying to create collective organizing around this very important issue. So thank you, guys.
Great, thank you both. And again, you can email Nadine at editor@momentmag.com. Please remember to go to our website at momentmag.com, where you can register for next week's Zoominar with Chen Julie Wong about from undocumented child to successful American Jewish lawyer and writer, which will be next week. Again, thank you, Ting Ting. Thank you, Nadine. And we will see everybody next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.